The dress was the color of a midnight sky, a deep, fathomless silk that seemed to drink the light and shimmer with hidden constellations. It had cost me more than my first car, a fact I found both obscene and deeply satisfying. Tonight wasn't about frugality or sensible choices. Tonight was about arrival. After 7 years of pouring my soul into the silicon veins of Ethos innovations, tonight was the night I was meant to be seen. My name is Alara Vance, and I am the chief architect of Project Chimera. That isn't just a title. It's a testament to 3 years of sleepless nights, caffeine-fueled epiphanies, and the kind of single-minded focus that leaves relationships and hobbies withering on the vine. Chimera was a revolutionary data synthesis algorithm, a piece of code so elegant and powerful it was poised to redefine our industry. It was my baby, my masterpiece. And it had just saved the company from a hostile takeover, generating a profit margin that made the board members weep with joy. The annual Zenith Gala, a notoriously exclusive event, was supposedly their way of saying thank you. My invitation had arrived via a personal courier, a heavy cream-colored card with my name inscribed in embossed gold lettering. Not a digital invite, not a memo, a statement. My boss, Marcus Thorne, had clapped me on the shoulder when he heard, his smile a little too tight around the edges. "Well-deserved, Alara. They're finally seeing what I've been telling them all along. You're a star." His words were honeyed, but I'd worked with him long enough to detect the faint, bitter aftertaste of resentment. Marcus was a manager, a politician. He managed people and managed perceptions. I, on the other hand, managed data. I created. The distinction was a chasm between us. As I applied the final touch of mascara, my reflection stared back at me from the minimalist mirror in my apartment. The woman looking back was sharp, her features defined by a persistent intensity. The midnight dress softened the edges, hinting at a glamour I rarely allowed myself to indulge in. For years, my uniform had been practical trousers and silk blouses, my hair pulled back in a severe knot. I was the woman in the server rooms, the one who spoke in code and schematics. Tonight, I was someone else, someone who belonged in the grand ballroom of the Empyrean Hotel. The ride over was a blur of city lights streaking past the window of the black car. I clutched my small, beaded purse, my heart a frantic hummingbird against my ribs. This wasn't just a party. It was a coronation. It was the moment Alastair Finch, the company's reclusive and legendary CEO, would publicly acknowledge my contribution. I'd only ever seen him from a distance, a tall, silver-haired specter of corporate power. Tonight, I imagined he would shake my hand. He would look me in the eye and say, "Well done, Ms. Vance." That simple validation was the peak I had been climbing toward for years. The Empyrean was breathtaking. A river of black-tie attire and shimmering gowns flowed up the marble steps, past towering floral arrangements that perfumed the air with lilies and ambition. The sound was a symphony of success, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the murmur of powerful voices, the soaring notes of a string quartet hidden somewhere in the gilded expanse. I felt a surge of belonging, a rightness. This was my world now. I presented my invitation at the check-in table, a long mahogany desk manned by 3 impeccably dressed women with identical, practiced smiles. One of them, a blonde with a name tag that read Cynthia, ran a perfectly manicured finger down a list on her tablet. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of confusion that sent the first, tiny icicle of dread into my stomach. "Ah, Ms. Vance," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Yes, welcome, we have you right this way." She didn't point toward the grand archway that led into the ballroom, the source of all the light and music. Instead, she gestured to a different hostess, a younger woman who gave me a look I couldn't quite decipher. Was it pity? "Chloe will escort you to your table," Cynthia said, her smile firmly back in place, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. A knot began to tighten in my chest as Chloe led me away from the thrumming heart of the gala. We walked past the entrance to the main ballroom, and I caught a glimpse of the scene inside. Chandeliers dripping with crystals like frozen waterfalls, tables draped in white linen and laden with silver, and the faces of the company's executive elite, all laughing and radiant. Marcus was there, holding a glass of scotch, deep in conversation with the CFO. He saw me, I'm sure of it. His eyes flickered in my direction for a moment before he turned away, a little too quickly. We continued down a less opulent corridor, the thick Persian carpet giving way to standard hotel-grade flooring. The music faded, replaced by the distant, rhythmic hum of a service elevator. Chloe stopped in front of an unmarked wooden door, identical to the ones I assumed led to storage closets or staff rooms. "Here you are, Ms. Vance," she said, her voice a soft, apologetic murmur. She opened the door. The room was not a ballroom. It was a conference room, hastily repurposed. The air was stuffy, smelling faintly of old coffee and industrial cleaner. There were 4 round tables, but they weren't covered in linen. They were draped in what looked like disposable paper tablecloths. The centerpieces were not extravagant floral arrangements, but single, sad-looking carnations in small glass vases. Plastic water pitchers stood in for crystal carafes. And the people. There were maybe a dozen of them, scattered amongst the tables, looking just as bewildered and out of place as I felt. I recognized them, not from board meetings or strategy sessions, but from the periphery of my professional life. They were the interns. The fresh-faced, 20-year-old summer hires, all dressed in their best, ill-fitting suits and rented dresses, their expressions a mixture of youthful excitement and dawning confusion. They looked at me, then at my midnight silk dress, and a wave of silent understanding passed through the room. This was the auxiliary room, the children's table, the holding pen for the unimportant. Chloe was still holding the door, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "Can I get you anything?" she asked. My throat was tight, my tongue a dry stone in my mouth. I couldn't form a word. I simply stared into the room at the flimsy tables and the faces of the interns who had been shuffled out of sight just like me. My invitation, the heavy cream card with its embossed gold lettering, felt like a scorching brand in my purse. They invited me to the company's gala. The words echoed in my head, a cruel, mocking chant. They had invited me, but they hadn't invited me in. I stepped across the threshold. The click of my heels on the linoleum floor sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. The door swung shut behind me, sealing me in the dim, silent purgatory. Through the wall, I could hear a muffled roar of laughter from the main ballroom, a world away. The humiliation was a physical thing. It rose from my stomach, hot and acidic, burning its way up my throat. It prickled behind my eyes and chilled the skin on my arms. I, Alara Vance, the architect of the most profitable project in Ethelred's history, had been seated in the broom closet with the summer help. One of the interns, a young man with earnest eyes who I vaguely remembered from the data entry pool, gave me a hesitant, sympathetic smile. "I guess they overbooked," he offered, his voice cracking slightly. But I knew better. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a mistake. In the cold, calculated world of corporate politics, there were no accidents. This was a message. My midnight dress suddenly felt like a costume, a foolish, extravagant joke I had played on myself. I stood there, frozen in the center of the room, a monument to my own naivety. They hadn't seen a star. They had seen a tool, and now that its purpose was served, it was being put back in the shed. The sting wasn't just in the insult. It was in the cold, public precision of it. They wanted me to know my place. And it was here in the shadows, far from the light. For a long moment, I considered walking out. I could turn around, push through that door, and vanish into the city night, leaving my career, my project, my 7 years of devotion behind like a snakeskin. The thought was seductive, a promise of immediate relief from the crushing weight of humiliation. But then I looked at the interns. They were watching me, their young faces a mixture of awe and pity. They had seen me in meetings, a distant, authoritative figure who commanded 6-figure budgets and the attention of senior engineers. And now they were seeing me here, cast into the wilderness with them. If I fled, their pity would be the only story told. They would remember the brilliant architect who was broken by a bad table assignment. I would not be broken, not like this. Slowly, deliberately, I moved toward an empty chair at a table with 3 interns. My silk dress rustled, a sound far too rich for the Spartan room. I sat, the motion stiff, regal. "Alara Vance," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, extending a hand to the nearest young woman. She had bright, intelligent eyes and a dress that was a shade too formal, as if she'd tried very hard to get it right. "Maya," she breathed, shaking my hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm. "Maya Jensen, we're all from the summer cohort." "I know," I said. The other 2 at the table mumbled their names. We sat in a strained silence, the muffled thumps of the bass from the ballroom next door a constant, mocking reminder of where we were not. A waiter, looking harried and annoyed at having to service the annex, appeared and unceremoniously sloshed some lukewarm water into our plastic cups. He didn't offer champagne. I decided to endure it. I would sit through this entire farce with my head held high. I would eat the rubbery chicken they would inevitably serve us and make polite conversation with these children who were born the year I started university. This would not be my breaking point. It would be my observation deck. From the conversations around me, I pieced together their stories. They were all thrilled just to be invited, seeing it as a sign of their potential. They'd spent weeks planning their outfits. One young man had rented his tuxedo and was worried about spilling something on it. Their innocence was a sharp, painful contrast to my own curdled disillusionment. They saw an administrative error. I saw a public execution. The door opened periodically, a brief slash of bright light and joyous noise cutting through our quiet gloom. People from the main event would peer in, sometimes looking for the restroom, their faces flickering with confusion and then a dawning, often cruel, understanding. They'd see us, the room of rejects, and their eyes would slide over me, widening in recognition. I saw a few of my colleagues, people I'd worked with on Chimera. They didn't meet my gaze. They just turned and disappeared back into the party, becoming accomplices through their silence. An hour into the ordeal, Damien Cross appeared at the doorway. Damien was my peer, another lead architect who saw my success not as an inspiration but as a personal affront. He was talented but lazy, a master of taking credit and deflecting blame. He stood there, a glass of what was certainly vintage scotch in his hand, and a wide, predatory smirk on his face. He didn't pretend he was lost. He looked directly at me. "Vance," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Networking with the new talent? Smart. Always good to know who'll be fetching your coffee next year." The interns froze. My knuckles were white where I gripped my plastic cup. I met his gaze, my expression a carefully constructed mask of indifference. "Someone has to appreciate the future of the company, Damien," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You've always been more focused on its past glories." His smirk tightened. He gave a theatrical shrug, took a deliberate sip of his scotch, and melted back into the light and noise, his objective accomplished. He had come to witness my shame, to poke the animal in the cage. The interns stared at their plates, the air thick with attention they were too young to fully comprehend. But Maya Jensen was watching me, her brow furrowed, her intelligent eyes seeing more than the others. She saw the barb, and she saw that it had landed. I made it through the rest of the night on pure, unadulterated rage. I barely touched the dismal food. I asked the interns about their projects, offered advice on their code, and learned about their aspirations. I performed the role of a senior mentor, turning their prison into my impromptu salon. It was a lie, a shield, but it was better than sitting in silence. When the event finally wound down, I left through a side exit, avoiding the river of departing guests. I didn't want to see Marcus or any other executive. I didn't want to see their feigned sympathy or their triumphant stares. The next morning, the office was a minefield of unspoken knowledge. The air itself felt different, charged with the electricity of shared gossip. People who would normally greet me with a cheerful, "Good morning," suddenly found the floor fascinating as I walked past. Emails I sent about routine project follow-ups went unanswered for hours. I was being ghosted by an entire department. The gala hadn't just been a party. It had been a recalibration of the corporate hierarchy, and I had been officially moved to the bottom. I went to Marcus's office. His door was open and he was on the phone, laughing. He saw me. And his expression instantly became serious. He finished his call and gestured for me to sit, his face a mask of concern. "Alara, I was so sorry to hear about the mix-up last night," he began, not a hint of sincerity in his voice. "A complete fiasco with the event planners. They overbooked the venue, can you believe it? So unprofessional." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch. An overbooking that exclusively affected the interns and the chief architect of Project Chimera. That's a remarkable coincidence, Marcus. He had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. He shuffled some papers on his desk. "Now, Alara, don't be dramatic. It was an unfortunate mistake, that's all. I've already lodged a formal complaint. In the grand scheme of things, it's just a party." "It was the Zenith Gala," I countered, my voice low and cold. "It was the company's official celebration of a landmark year, a year made possible by my project. And I was seated in a storage closet. That's not a mistake, that's a statement." He leaned back, his magnanimous mask slipping to reveal the hard steel of his authority beneath. "You're being sensitive. You did great work on Chimera, no one is denying that. But you can't let a little seating error poison your attitude. We have a lot of work to do, now if that's all." He turned his attention pointedly to his computer screen. Dismissed. I went to Human Resources next. A cheerful woman named Brenda listened patiently, nodding and typing notes, her expression radiating practiced empathy. She promised a full investigation. I knew, with absolute certainty, that her notes would be deleted the moment I left her office. HR at Ethelred wasn't there to protect employees. It was there to protect the company from employees. I was a loose cannon, a potential problem, and they would handle me by burying me in procedure and platitudes until I gave up. I walked back to my desk feeling utterly isolated, a ghost haunting the halls I had once commanded. They were closing ranks, from my direct superior to the corporate bureaucracy. I was alone. Later that afternoon, as I was staring blankly at a screen of code that now felt alien to me, a shadow fell over my desk. It was Maya Jensen, the intern from my table. She was clutching a tablet to her chest like a shield. "Ms. Vance," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I'm sorry to bother you." "It's fine, Maya. What is it?" She glanced around nervously, then leaned in closer. "I don't know if this is anything," she said, her words coming in a rush. "But last week I was dropping off some documents for Mr. Thorne. He was in a meeting with someone from the events department. I wasn't trying to listen, but his door was open. I heard him say," she hesitated, biting her lip. "What did you hear, Maya?" I prompted, my focus sharpening like a lens. "He said, the auxiliary room needs to be handled discreetly. No direct signage. It's for overflow." And then he laughed and said, "Specifically, the intern overflow and Ms. Vance." The events person sounded confused, but Mr. Thorne just told her to make sure the seating chart for the main hall was finalized without those names. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but after last night. The world, which had been a confusing, blurry mess, snapped into sharp, brutal focus. The icicle of dread I'd felt at the reception desk had become a glacier in my gut. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a coordinated, deliberate act of sabotage, orchestrated by my own boss. And he had been careless enough to say my name aloud. I looked at Maya. She was terrified. A summer intern bringing this information to a senior architect was a career-ending risk. But she had done it anyway. She had seen an injustice and taken a side. "Thank you, Maya," I said, my voice quiet but imbued with a new, cold fire. "You have no idea how much this helps. I will not forget this." She gave a tiny, relieved nod and scurried away. I turned back to my monitor, but I wasn't seeing the code anymore. I was seeing a network of data points. Marcus, Damien's triumphant smirk, HR's stonewalling, the averted eyes in the hallway. It was all connected. They hadn't just put me in a room. They were trying to erase me. They wanted to sever my connection to Project Chimera in the minds of the company's elite before they claimed it as their own. The humiliation wasn't the end goal. It was just a tool. A slow, icy calm washed over me. The hurt was still there, a raw wound beneath my ribs, but it was being rapidly eclipsed by something else. A pure, crystalline resolve. Marcus thought he was a politician. Damien thought he was a predator. They thought I was just a coder, a quiet worker bee they could swat aside. But they had forgotten what I really was. I was an architect. I designed systems. I find vulnerabilities. And I was about to discover every single flaw in theirs. They had invited me to a party and tried to make me disappear. They had no idea they had just invited me to a war. The next day, I requested a meeting with Maya in one of the small, soundproofed work pods on the 3rd floor, a neutral space far from the prying eyes of my department. She arrived looking nervous, clutching her tablet like it could ward off evil spirits. I had her sweep the room for listening devices, a trick I'd learned from a paranoid but brilliant network security expert years ago. The gesture was more for effect than genuine concern, designed to shift her mindset from that of a terrified intern to that of a co-conspirator. We were behind enemy lines now. "I'm not going to ask you to do anything that puts you in direct jeopardy, Maya," I began, my voice low and even. "But I need information. Access. You can go places I can't right now. You're invisible. I'm a target." Her eyes, wide and dark, met mine. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a spark of defiance had been lit. She had seen what they did to me at the gala. She had heard the lie from Marcus's own lips. She was young, but she had a strong sense of justice. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice firming. "Server logs for the marketing and executive strategy decks. Specifically, I need to see the version history and access permissions for any presentation related to Project Chimera created in the last 2 months. And I need hard copies of Marcus Thorne's and Damien Cross's official calendars for the next quarter." It was a tall order, but as an intern rotating through departments, she had temporary, low-level access to a wide range of systems. She was a ghost in the machine. While I was locked out, she could still wander the digital hallways. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the task. Our alliance was sealed. That night, I didn't go home. I waited until the office was a hollow shell, populated only by the quiet hum of servers and the rhythmic breathing of the HVAC system. Then I went to work. My first step was not to attack, but to build a fortress. I migrated all my original Chimera source code, my private notes, my architectural diagrams, and every email I had ever sent or received on the subject to a series of encrypted, off-site servers. I created a digital dead man's switch. If my network access was suddenly revoked, all the data would be automatically packaged and sent to my personal lawyer and a select list of tech journalists. It was a dark thought, but the gala had taught me that I was dealing with people who had no qualms about corporate assassination. I needed insurance. With my legacy secured, I began to hunt. Maya had delivered. An encrypted file appeared in a shared folder containing the logs I'd asked for. I poured myself a cup of the office's notoriously bad coffee and began to trace the breadcrumbs. It was exactly as I suspected, only more brazen. For the past 2 months, Marcus and Damien had been systematically creating a new narrative around Chimera. They had copied my original presentation decks, stripping my name from the metadata and replacing it with their own. They had created new slides filled with marketing buzzwords and strategic projections, phrasing that was Marcus's signature style. They were translating my complex, elegant creation into a language the board could understand, and in doing so, they were claiming the role of translator, visionary, and, ultimately, creator. The server logs were the smoking gun. I could see the timestamps, the IP addresses from their terminals. I saw how Damien had accessed the core schematic files at 3 a.m. one Tuesday, exporting them into a new file format. I saw how Marcus had created a document titled Chimera, Phase 2 Rollout, and had set the permissions to exclude me explicitly. They were building a parallel history, a digital forgery that would, over time, become the official record. The gala was the social component of that forgery, the public debut of my irrelevance. Then I found the centerpiece of their plan. It was a presentation scheduled for the quarterly board and investor meeting just 3 weeks away. The title was Harnessing the Future, Ethelred's Next Decade by Marcus Thorne and Damien Cross. The entire presentation was about Chimera. My name was not mentioned once. Not in the credits, not in the acknowledgements, not even in the technical appendix. According to this document, I did not exist. They had written me out of my own story. They were planning to stand on that stage, in front of the most powerful people in the company, and present my life's work as their own. The audacity of it left me breathless. This was the deadline, the ticking clock. In 3 weeks, their lie would be cemented into the corporate firmament, and any protest I made would sound like the bitter whining of a disgruntled employee. My anger was a cold, clean thing now. It fueled a focus I hadn't felt since the final, frantic weeks of building Chimera. I knew their strategy, but I still didn't fully understand the motive. Stealing credit for a major project would guarantee them promotions and massive bonuses, yes, but the scale of this deception felt disproportionate. The risk they were taking was immense. There had to be something more. The answer, as always, was in the data. Not in the presentation decks or the server logs, but in the numbers. As the project's architect and initial manager, I still had vestigial access to the budget and resource allocation dashboards for Chimera. It was a loose end they hadn't thought to tie up. They probably assumed I would never look, or that I wouldn't understand the complex web of expenditures. They were wrong. I spent the next 2 nights poring over line items, cross-referencing invoices, and tracking resource flows. The main project budget was clean, meticulously accounted for. But on the periphery, in a sub-project chartered for synergistic hardware integration testing, a meaningless corporate phrase I now realized was intentional camouflage. I found it. It was a series of payments, starting small and growing steadily over the last 6 months, to a third-party vendor I had never heard of, Orion Digital Solutions. The invoices were vague, citing consulting fees and proprietary software licensing. The sums were staggering. Millions of dollars. No such consulting had ever taken place. Chimera needed no external software licenses. Its beauty was that it was built entirely from scratch. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I ran a search for Orion Digital Solutions. The company had a bare-bones website, full of stock photos and empty jargon. It listed a corporate address that was nothing more than a P.O. box in Delaware. The company had been incorporated just 7 months ago. There were no press releases, no client lists, no product information. It was a ghost, a shell corporation. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about stolen glory anymore. This was a heist. Marcus was using the massive, complex budget of my project as a cover to siphon millions of dollars out of the company. He was approving fraudulent invoices to a company that didn't exist, and the money was disappearing into the ether. He needed to take absolute control of Chimera's narrative, to become its undisputed father, so that no one else would ever have the authority to look too closely at its finances. He wasn't just erasing my name from a presentation. He was erasing the only witness who could ever unravel his crime. My humiliation at the gala suddenly seemed like a quaint, almost trivial insult. I had been worried about my career, my reputation. I hadn't realized I had stumbled into a conspiracy that could lead to federal prison time for the man who orchestrated it. I leaned back in my chair, the darkened office pressing in around me. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. I was no longer just fighting for credit. I was in possession of information that could destroy one of the company's most powerful executives. And powerful men, when cornered, do not play by the rules. They don't just seat you in an auxiliary room. They burn the whole building down to silence the one person who knows their secret. The screen in front of me glowed with the evidence, a ticking bomb that I now held in my hands. The question was no longer how to get my name back on the project. The question was how to detonate this bomb without being at ground zero. I sat in the glow of my monitor for what felt like hours, the damning financial data casting long shadows across my desk. The office was a tomb. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. The knowledge I now possessed was a physical weight. It wasn't just a key to my own vindication. It was a stick of dynamite that could blow a hole in the side of the company and take down a very powerful, very cornered man. And I was standing right next to it. My first instinct was survival. I logged out of the network, powered down my machine, and packed my bag with trembling hands. The walk to my car in the deserted parking garage was an exercise in controlled paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every glint of metal from a parked car seemed like a watchful eye. When I got to my apartment, I did a full sweep, checking the small, discreet security sensors I'd installed myself. I drew the blinds and sat in the dark. The city lights of the skyline I usually found so beautiful now feeling like a million indifferent stares. Who could I trust? The question cycled endlessly in my mind. HR was a corporate firewall. The board of directors was an unknown quantity, a collection of names and faces who saw the world through the lens of profit and loss statements. They might even see Marcus's embezzlement as a problem to be contained, not a crime to be punished. And Alastair Finch, the CEO, he was an enigma. To approach him with an accusation of this magnitude against a senior executive, without ironclad, irrefutable, kindergarten-simple proof, was to risk being labeled a hysterical conspiracy theorist and quietly dismissed. I had the data, yes, but data could be explained away, spun, buried in jargon. They would call it a misunderstanding. They would commission an internal investigation led by their own people, and I would be professionally and permanently silenced long before it concluded. No, I couldn't use their system to fight them. It was designed to protect its own. I had to create a new vector of attack, one they wouldn't see coming. The stage was already set for their grand performance, the quarterly board meeting. They had chosen the time and the place to erase me. I would use it as the time and place to expose them. A new kind of resolve began to crystallize out of my fear. They saw me as a coder, a technical tool. They would expect me to fight like one, with a formal complaint, a detailed email, a dossier of evidence. They would never expect me to fight like an architect, not of buildings or code, but of moments. I would design a moment of perfect, undeniable truth. My plan began to form, not as a list of steps, but as a schematic in my mind. A live demonstration, a public detonation. I wouldn't just present the evidence. I would make the data itself tell the story in real time on the massive screen in the boardroom, right in the middle of their triumphant presentation. I spent the next 3 weeks living a double life. By day, I was the subdued, defeated Alara Vance. I went to my meetings, responded to emails with a noticeable delay, and acted like a woman nursing a bruised ego. I let them think their little Gala stunt had worked, that I had been cowed into submission. I could feel Damien's smug gaze on me in the hallways, and Marcus treated me with a cloying, paternalistic pity that made my skin crawl. They were letting their guard down, confident that their victim was neutralized. By night, I was a ghost. I worked from a series of anonymous public Wi-Fi hotspots, using a clean laptop and encrypted communication channels to coordinate with Maya. She was my lifeline, my eyes and ears inside the company. She smuggled out network topology maps, security protocol documents, and most importantly, the exact model and software specifications of the presentation hardware used in the executive boardroom. While they were polishing their slides, I was building my weapon. I called it the Witness. It was not a PowerPoint. It was a self-executing application disguised as a harmless video driver update file. Once on the presentation system, it would lie dormant, invisible to any standard security scan. It had only one purpose: to listen. It would monitor the system for a specific, unique trigger, a particular phrase spoken into the room's microphone array, a sequence of keystrokes on the presentation remote, or a specific image file being displayed on screen. When the trigger was activated, the Witness would take over. It wouldn't crash the system, it would hijack it. On the screen, my program would bloom to life. It was the most complex piece of data visualization I had ever created. I designed it to be irrefutable. It would start with an animated timeline of Project Chimera's creation, showing the Git commits under my name, the timestamps of my work, flowing like a river of light from my credentials. Then it would show a second, parasitic timeline emerging, the documents created by Marcus and Damien, visually demonstrating how they copied my work and stripped my name. The visualization would then pivot. It would display the corporate structure of Ethelred on one side of the screen and the incorporation documents for the shell company, Orion Digital Solutions, on the other. With a series of stark, simple animations, it would show the money trail, the approval of fraudulent invoices by Marcus Thorne, the transfer of millions from Chimera's sub-project budget, and the flow of that money directly into the ghost entity. Every transaction was sourced, every invoice number displayed, every date and amount perfectly logged. There would be no room for interpretation. It was a confession rendered in data. The work was grueling. I barely slept, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of caffeine, anger, and fear. I felt the immense pressure of the ticking clock. Every line of code had to be perfect. Any bug, any error, and the entire plan would collapse. My alliance with Maya deepened. She rose to the occasion with a courage that humbled me. She was the one who, under the guise of an IT audit she herself had cleverly instigated, would get my Trojan horse onto the system. She found a network vulnerability, a rarely used maintenance port on the boardroom's AV rack that was not subject to the same stringent security monitoring as the main network. We had our way in. The personal cost was immense. I felt myself becoming harder, colder. The woman who had picked out a midnight-colored silk dress in hopeful anticipation of a party felt like a stranger from another lifetime. That woman was gone. In her place was a strategist, a saboteur, a woman who now saw the world as a system of vulnerabilities to be exploited. On the last night, the night before the board meeting, I put the finishing touches on the witness. It was complete. Elegant, vicious, and undeniable. I uploaded the final compiled file to a secure drop point for Maya. The plan was in motion. There was no turning back. I stood on my apartment balcony, looking out at the sprawling, glittering city. For weeks, I had been a ghost, working in the shadows, fueled by a secret. Tomorrow, I would step back into the light. But I would not be coming back for a seat at the table. I was coming to burn the table down. I held my phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over Maya's contact. I typed a single, coded message, the one we had agreed upon to signal that the final piece was in place. The architect is home. I hit send. Then I went inside and laid out the most severe, most impeccably tailored suit I owned. If I was going to war, I would be dressed for it. The executive boardroom on the 40th floor was a place of quiet, immense power. It was designed to intimidate, with a single, colossal mahogany table that seemed to absorb the light and a floor-to-ceiling window offering a godlike view of the city below. The air was cool and still, smelling of expensive leather and ambition. I had only been in this room twice before, both times as a junior engineer presenting technical data to a wall of impassive faces. Today, I entered not as a presenter, but as a ghost at the feast. Dressed in my severe, charcoal gray suit, I was a stark slash of color against the room's warm wood tones. I took a seat in one of the chairs lining the wall, away from the main table, positioning myself as an observer, a nonentity. My presence was unusual but not unprecedented. Senior project leads were sometimes invited to observe board meetings. No one gave me more than a passing glance. They were all too busy with their hushed, important conversations. I saw Marcus and Damien near the front, schmoozing with a few of the board members. They were glowing, preening in the spotlight of their impending triumph. Marcus caught my eye for a fleeting second. He gave me a small, condescending nod, a gesture that said, "See, this is where the real players sit." I met his gaze with a placid emptiness that seemed to unsettle him before he turned away. My heart was a cold, heavy drum against my ribs. My hands, resting on my lap, were perfectly still. Inside, a high-frequency tremor of adrenaline and terror was vibrating through my entire being. I had checked and rechecked every line of code. I had run 1,000 simulations in my mind. Maya had confirmed via a single character text message an hour earlier. The package was delivered and active. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for the wolves to step into it. Alistair Finch entered the room last. The ambient chatter ceased instantly. He moved with an unhurried grace that commanded absolute authority, his silver hair catching the light. He took his seat at the head of the table, his eyes sweeping across the room. They rested on me for a fraction of a second longer than they did on anyone else. There was no readable expression on his face, just a calm, assessing intelligence. He gave a curt nod, and the meeting began. The first hour was a tedious procession of financial reports and market analyses. I barely heard them. My entire consciousness was focused on the massive, high-definition screen that dominated the front wall, and on the laptop that controlled it. The presentation was being run from a dedicated machine in a sleek lectern. Marcus and Damien would be standing there soon. Finally, Finch announced the next agenda item. And now, Marcus Thorne and Damien Cross will present the strategic vision for Project Chimera and its next phase implementation. My pulse quickened. This was it. Marcus and Damien strode to the lectern, their faces alight with practiced confidence. They were a perfect corporate duo. Marcus, the silver-tongued senior statesman, and Damien, the sharp, aggressive technical mind. It was all a lie. "Thank you, Alistair," Marcus began, his voice smooth and resonant. "Members of the board, honored investors, what we are about to show you is more than just a project update. It is a glimpse into the future of this company, a future we have meticulously architected." He clicked the remote. The first slide of their stolen presentation appeared on the screen, harnessing the future with their names in bold. huge, bold letters underneath. For 20 minutes, I sat in silence and listened to them say what they said. They used my phrases, my concepts, my architectural metaphors, all twisted and simplified for a corporate audience. They spoke of Chimera as if they had conceived it in a fever dream, as if they had personally laid every brick of its digital foundation. The board was captivated. They nodded along, impressed by the grandeur of the vision, oblivious to the fact that they were applauding a pair of thieves. My focus narrowed to a single point, the trigger phrase. Maya had managed to record a rehearsal Marcus had been practicing in his office. He was a creature of habit and ego. He would stick to his script. The phrase was his crowning statement, the one designed to cement his ownership of the project's core concept in the minds of the board. Damien finished his technical overview, and Marcus stepped forward for the closing remarks. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes sweeping across the powerful faces at the table. My hand slipped into my pocket, my fingers closing around a small, smooth stone I had been carrying for weeks, its coldness grounding me. "And so, in conclusion," Marcus said, his voice swelling with false passion, "it is this unique, holistic approach that makes Chimera not just a success, but a revolution. Its power lies not in the code, but in the philosophy behind it. And the architecture of Chimera is a testament to our forward-thinking, proprietary vision." He said it, the trigger phrase. For one perfect, silent second, nothing happened. The slide with their names remained on the screen. I saw a flicker of relief in Marcus's eyes, and then the screen went black. A collective murmur went through the room. Damien tapped furiously at the laptop, his confident facade crumbling into panic. "Just a minor technical glitch, everyone," Marcus said, his voice a little too loud. But it wasn't a glitch. From the center of the black screen, a single line of light began to draw itself. Then another and another, coalescing into a familiar shape, the logo of Project Chimera. But underneath it, new words appeared, stark and white against the black. "A project by Alara Vance." Before anyone could speak, the witness began its work. I stood up. My movement was slow, deliberate, drawing every eye in the room. I walked calmly to the side of the room, where a secondary microphone was set up. I switched it on. "There is no glitch," I said, my voice amplified, calm and clear, cutting through the confusion. "What you are about to see is a real-time audit of Project Chimera." On the screen, the animated timeline I had built began to play. A river of data flowed across the screen, showing thousands of code commits, architectural drafts, and emails, all originating from a single node labeled EVANCE. The board stared, mesmerized and confused. "For 3 years, I was the sole architect and lead developer of this project," I narrated, my voice devoid of emotion. "My work is time-stamped, digitally signed, and logged on the company's own servers." Then, as my timeline continued to flow, a second, smaller stream branched off from it, red like a hemorrhage. It flowed to 2 new nodes, MTHORNE and D-Cross. The animation showed them copying my files, stripping the metadata, and rebranding the work as their own. The dates and times of their digital plagiarism were displayed in stark, brutal detail. Gasps rippled through the room. Marcus was sheet-white, his mouth agape. Damien looked like he was going to be physically sick. "This was the theft of credit," I continued, my voice as cold as ice. "But it was only a means to an end. The real goal was the theft of money." The display changed. The E-Trade corporate ledger appeared on one side, and the incorporation papers for Orion Digital Solutions appeared on the other. Then, like a death sentence, the animation drew a direct, glowing line from Marcus Thorne's digital signature to a series of multi-million-dollar wire transfers out of Chimera's budget and into the shell corporation. The invoice numbers, the dates, the exact amounts, it was all there, rendered with perfect, irrefutable clarity. Marcus Thorne used my project, a project he could not understand, as a shield to embezzle over $12 million from this company. I stopped speaking. The final image of the money trail remained frozen on the screen. The silence in the room was absolute, a crushing pressure. Every single person was staring at Marcus and Damien, who stood at the lectern as if they had been turned to stone. Then all eyes moved to the head of the table, to Alastair Finch. He had not moved a muscle. He had watched the entire presentation with an unnerving stillness. Now he slowly lifted his gaze from the screen and looked directly at Marcus. His face was calm, but his eyes were like chips of flint. The moment stretched into an eternity, the silent, damning evidence on the screen, the two guilty men trapped in the spotlight, and the quiet, terrifying judgment of the man who ran it all. The gauntlet had been run. The bomb had gone off, and all that was left was the fallout. The silence in the boardroom was a living thing. It was thick with shock, accusation, and the death of two careers. The damning evidence of the money trail remained frozen on the screen, a digital epitaph. Marcus Thorne's face was the color of ash. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Damian Cross simply stared at the screen, his expression one of complete, utter unraveling. Alastair Finch broke the silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply leaned forward slightly and spoke two words into the silent room, his voice a blade of ice. "Get them out." It wasn't clear who he was speaking to, but two men from the corporate security detail, who had been standing discreetly by the door, immediately moved forward. Their steps were silent and efficient on the thick carpet. The spell shattered. Marcus finally found his voice, a desperate, strangled sound. "Alastair, this is a misunderstanding, a fabrication. She's a disgruntled employee, she." "Marcus," Finch said, his voice cutting through the stammered excuses with surgical precision. "Be quiet." The finality in that statement was absolute. It was not a request. It was the closing of a door, the turning of a key. Marcus's mouth snapped shut. All the bluster, all the arrogant confidence he had worn like a tailored suit, evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, hollowed-out man. The security guards reached him and Damian, each placing a firm hand on an arm. There was no struggle. They were led out of the boardroom like ghosts, their departure punctuated by the quiet, decisive click of the door closing behind them. The room erupted in a cacophony of hushed, frantic whispers. Board members turned to each other, their faces a mixture of outrage and awe. Investors were already murmuring into their phones. I stood by the microphone, my hand still resting on its cool metal surface. The adrenaline that had sustained me was beginning to recede, and a deep, profound tremor was starting in its place. I had done it. I had actually done it. Finch rose to his feet. "This meeting is adjourned," he announced, his voice easily quelling the rising noise. The board members began to gather their things, their movements stiff and uncertain. They filed out of the room, many of them giving me a wide berth, looking at me with a new, unnerving mixture of fear and respect. I was no longer just Alara Vance, the architect. I was the woman who had publicly executed two senior executives. Soon, the only people left in the vast room were Finch and me. The evidence was still glowing on the screen behind him. He walked slowly, deliberately, from the head of the table until he was standing just a few feet away from me. He looked from my face to the screen and back again. "The witness," he said, his voice a low murmur. It wasn't a question. "Aptly named." "It seemed appropriate," I managed to say, my own voice sounding distant to my ears. "My office, now," he said. It was the same tone he had used with Marcus, quiet, unarguable. He turned and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. The walk to his office on the top floor was the longest of my life. The news was already spreading through the executive wing like a shockwave. I could see it in the faces of the assistants who stared at me from their desks, their eyes wide with disbelief. The whispers followed me down the hall. I felt like a foreign agent being escorted through the heart of an enemy command center after a successful mission, unsure if I was about to be decorated or shot. Finch's office was vast and minimalist, more art gallery than workspace. One entire wall was a window overlooking the city. He wasn't sitting behind his desk. He was standing by the window, his back to me, looking down at the world he had built. "For 6 months," he began, his voice calm and conversational, "I have known there was a leak in this company. A financial discrepancy buried so deep in the operational budgets that my best people couldn't find its source. I knew the numbers were wrong. I felt it, but I had no proof." He turned to face me. I suspected Marcus. He had the access, the ambition, and a complete lack of moral imagination. But he was clever. He insulated himself with layers of bureaucracy and plausible deniability. He gestured to one of the leather chairs. "Please, sit." I sat, perching on the edge of the seat. He remained standing, a towering figure against the backdrop of the sky. When the seating chart for the Zenith Gala was submitted for final review, I saw your name on the list for the auxiliary room, he continued. It was a small thing, a petty cruelty, but it was illogical. It was an inefficient distribution of company assets. You are one of our most valuable assets, Ms. Vance, and Marcus was seating you with the interns. It was a sloppy, arrogant move, and it confirmed for me where I needed to look. A cold realization washed over me. You knew. I knew that Marcus was trying to sideline you, he clarified. I did not know why precisely. I could have intervened. A quiet word and you would have been seated at the head table, but that would have accomplished nothing. Marcus would have known I was watching, and he would have buried his tracks even deeper, and I would not have learned what I needed to know about you. He paused, his eyes locking onto mine. I needed to see what you would do. Would you file a complaint with HR, which would have been buried? Would you resign, which would have been a waste? Or would you fight? I have enough people in this company who follow the rules, Ms. Vance. I am desperately short on people who know how to win. It was a test. The entire agonizing ordeal. My public humiliation, my isolation, my desperate, paranoid weeks of work. He had been watching it all from a distance, a grandmaster observing a chess match. He had let me suffer to see the quality of my response. The thought was chilling, and yet in a strange, ruthless way, it made a kind of perfect sense. Your witness, he said, a flicker of something that might have been admiration in his eyes, was the most elegant and brutal piece of corporate warfare I have ever witnessed. You didn't just bring me evidence. You created a verdict. You understood that the board doesn't respond to data, they respond to narratives, and you destroyed his. He walked over to his desk, but not to sit behind it. He leaned against it, crossing his arms. It was a posture of conversation, not of command. Marcus Thorne is gone. His entire senior team, all of whom were complicit through either corruption or incompetence, will be gone by the end of the day. His division, the Advanced Analytics Division he built around the stolen glory of your project, is a rudderless ship with a corrupt culture. He looked at me, his expression direct, intense. I am not offering you a promotion, Ms. Vance. A promotion is a reward for playing the game well. You have proven that you are capable of changing the game itself. I am offering you a command. I'm dissolving the entire division. In its place, I am creating a new one, Ethos Strategic Architectures. It will report directly to me. It will be built from the ground up on the true principles of Project Chimera: transparency, efficiency, and relentless innovation. And you will be its president. You will have your own budget, your own floor, and the absolute authority to build your own team. You will clean this house. I was speechless. The scale of the offer was staggering. President. It was a title so far beyond my ambitions that I had never even considered it. I had come into that boardroom fighting for my reputation. I was being offered a kingdom. The victory was not sweet. It was iron-hard, metallic on the tongue. It had been forged in humiliation and rage and fear, but it was real. I had looked into the abyss of the corporate machine and hadn't blinked, and the machine had rewarded me for it. I rose from the chair, my earlier tremor gone, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. Yes, I said. The word felt small, inadequate, but it was the only one necessary. Alistair Finch smiled. It was the first time I had ever seen him do so. It was not a warm smile, but it was a genuine one. Good, he said. Welcome to the 40th floor, Ms. Vance. Your real work begins here. 3 months later, I stood by the window in what had once been Alistair Finch's office. After the boardroom detonation, he had announced a major corporate restructure. He remained CEO, but he had moved his own office to the top floor of the company's newly acquired adjacent tower, a symbolic move to oversee his expanding empire. The 40th floor, the company's traditional seat of power, was now the headquarters of the new Ethelred Strategic Architectures Division. It was my floor, my kingdom. The view was the same one Finch had shown me that day, but it felt different from this side of the desk. It was no longer a backdrop. It was a responsibility. The city below was not an abstract painting of success, but a complex network of systems, data, and people, all of which were now, in some small way, my domain. The first few weeks had been a brutal, exhilarating whirlwind. A forensic accounting team had descended on Marcus's old division and unearthed a rot that went even deeper than I had discovered. A half-dozen senior managers were quietly terminated. Damian Cross, facing potential criminal charges, had cooperated fully, effectively ending his career in the industry. Marcus Thorne, on the advice of his lawyers, had disappeared from public life, his name now a whispered cautionary tale in the halls of Ethelred. My first official act as president was to send a company-wide memo offering Maya Jensen the position of my chief of staff. There were murmurs in the executive ranks. She was too young, too inexperienced. I ignored them. I didn't need experience in the old way of doing things. I needed intelligence, integrity, and loyalty. Maya had proven she possessed all three in abundance when it mattered most. She accepted the position, and watching her walk into her new office, her eyes bright with a fierce, determined intelligence, was the first true moment of satisfaction I had felt since my victory. Together, we rebuilt the division from the studs. We didn't just refill empty positions, we redefined them. We flattened the bloated hierarchy Marcus had built to protect himself. We instituted a policy of radical transparency in all project budgets. We promoted talented engineers who had been sidelined for their lack of political skill and hired brilliant minds from outside the company who were drawn to our new stated mission. We were building a meritocracy, not a bureaucracy. The change in me was profound. The quiet, heads-down architect necessarily replaced by a leader. I learned to command a room not with the cold fury of a proprietor, but with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her place. I learned to navigate the complex politics of the board, to speak the language of finance and strategy as fluently as I spoke Python. But I never forgot the lessons of the auxiliary room. I never forgot what it felt like to be deemed unimportant, to be rendered invisible. It became my guiding principle. In my division, everyone would be seen. One evening, long after everyone else had gone home, I took the elevator down to the third floor and walked to the small, windowless conference room where my humiliation had been staged. The hotel staff had long since cleared it, and it was back to its anonymous, functional state. I stood in the center of the empty room, the faint smell of industrial cleaner still hanging in the air. This was my ground zero, a place of shame transformed into a crucible. I had walked in here as a victim, full of righteous anger, but also of a certain naivety. I had believed that good work was its own reward, that the truth would naturally rise to the top. This room had taught me that the truth doesn't rise. It must be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. And that good work, without the power to protect it, is just a resource for others to exploit. I did not feel anger or sadness standing there. I felt a strange sense of gratitude. The woman who had been sent to this room no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, warier, and infinitely more capable. The room wasn't a painful memory. It was a memorial to the person I used to be. A year to the day after the boardroom confrontation, the invitation for the annual Zenith Gala arrived. It was, like before, a heavy cream-colored card delivered by a personal courier. But this time, it was not an invitation to attend. It was a request for me to be the keynote speaker. On the night of the gala, I once again found myself preparing. This time, the dress was not the color of a midnight sky, but of fire and molten gold. It was a statement not of hopeful arrival, but of unapologetic presence. As I looked at my reflection, I saw the changes the year had wrought. The intensity in my eyes was still there, but it was tempered now by a calm, unshakable confidence. The lines around them were a little deeper, evidence of the long hours and the weight of command. I arrived at the Empyrean Hotel, and this time the river of guests parted for me. Alastair Finch was waiting just inside the entrance. He greeted me with a respectful nod. "Ilara," he said, "the evening is yours." I walked into the grand ballroom, a place I had only glimpsed from a distant corridor a year ago. The chandeliers dripped light, the champagne flowed, and the symphony of success was in full swell. But it sounded different to me now. It wasn't a world I was hopping to join. It was a world that was now, in part, listening to me. Maya was there, radiant in a sapphire gown, already networking with board members who now treated her as a peer. She caught my eye across the room and gave me a brilliant smile, a shared acknowledgement of the impossible journey we had taken. Later, I stood at the lectern on the main stage, looking out at the sea of faces, the powerful, the ambitious, the hopeful. The interns from this year's cohort were there, seated at prime tables near the front. It was one of my new policies. I looked at their young, eager faces and saw myself. "A year ago," I began, my voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the opulent room, "I learned a valuable lesson about this company. I learned that sometimes the most important work happens not in the spotlight, but in the auxiliary rooms. I learned that being unseen is not the same as being unimportant, and I learned that a person's true worth is not determined by where they are seated, but by what they are willing to build when no one is watching." My gaze swept the room, and I saw my story reflected in their eyes, a story they all now knew. It was a story of humiliation turned to triumph, of exile turned to empowerment. I was no longer the woman who had been sent to the broom closet. I was the woman who had come back and redesigned the whole building. And as I looked out at the light, the power, and the future of the company, I knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that I was finally, truly, in my proper place.